Greetings and welcome to Module 3. And a very special thank you to those of you who have invited me out to your states to run races. Really meant a lot to me to see those. Also, glad you noticed the little bio about me I sent out. If only I could take the class and my other courses on tour, so to speak, right? Run a half marathon or a 5K or a 10K for in support of a cause in your communities. Take my teaching on tour. That'd be extremely cool. I actually just finished a glow run tonight for a Northeast Arkansas cause. That was a lot of fun. But given where I was driving by, I thought I'm stopping the office and record this video because for several days I've been working on these talking points and geeking out over Lancashire Nobel, and really my head's swimming with it. So I figured now is the time. But take a moment to pause and ponder here. You have already 2 modules content completed, almost halfway through the course. Indeed, it flies by in the 5-week format, right? So this week we've got a major milestone, the submission of your theoretical exploration short paper by Sunday night, the 16th, end of day, 11:59 p.m. Central. This week's additional video, I'll talk a little bit more about that short paper. Definitely make sure you've looked at the additional videos for Module 1 and Module 2 if you haven't already. They will feed into the paper's academic writing style as well. But this week we'll talk more about the assignment itself, right? Again, the ever-present reminder about reading mass emails, which I will send out for common questions, urgent or helpful advice, as well as the weekly updates, and the most important ones will be in parallel on the announcement section. But please make sure you're checking that A-State email address daily. So hopefully you all have noticed a very strong trend that's happened in Blackboard, specifically that state-level affiliate journal additional discussion. It looks like you have all found very solid state-level affiliate options. Some of you on the NCTE affiliate side and some of you on the ILA affiliate side, but what I really think is cool is how you looked at both, and some of you had a clear decision to make, some of you had options, but it looks like everybody found a solid option. Some might not publish more than twice a year. Some affiliates publish once a year. That's okay. Don't ever worry about something you submit being under review for a long time. I've had articles under review for nearly a year sometimes, and it doesn't go that way at the state level. But don't worry about that. If you have a contact person, if you have a submission pathway, don't worry. You leave it in their hands. And then the waiting game. That's how it goes, but that's okay. Some may not have had the clearest requirements, or some may seem very, very, very open in their requirements. Again, don't worry about that. Trust what they put out there as their requirements. I've seen APA format across the board in everybody's, right. So that's certainly helpful. If you haven't already done so, don't hesitate to reach out to that contact individual listed with the journal, the editor, that sort of thing, and let them know your goals and your intention to submit something in a few weeks. Trust me, they will appreciate this. I promise you, knowing that a submission is going to be coming in a few weeks, knowing that their work has been what they edit and have put on the website has been browsed, that sort of thing. So browsing your links, further, I've seen a lot of essay categories, a lot of teacher perspective categories. This is also good news that they have options besides just empirical research, right? And which again, this is what I would hope and expect for each of you at the state level. But it's great to actually see it. I think that you'll see a lot of neat things happening in other states, and I noticed also that a number of you have really neat looking state level gatherings coming up in the fall. Why not start thinking about it if you haven't? I mean, that would be great. And if you think that you're making a strong contact by email, submitting a publication to their journal, imagine the contacts you make in person at the state level gathering. And I will say that here in Arkansas, I have experienced some amazing state level gatherings, a lot of passionate teachers and passionate university faculty members, a lot of amazing work, just great people. As amazing as national conferences are, sometimes there's so much hustle and bustle. It's so fast paced. It's hard to really feel like you connect, not just with individuals but with the material. I have been so surprised pleasantly in my time here in Arkansas that I have just had amazing state level conference experiences, some amazing keynote speakers, and just also just experiencing more of the state, other institutions in the state that I might not otherwise have visited. So it's been great. As I also mentioned in last week's email, don't forget to put strong academic and collegial effort into your peer response postings. Remember, they're an academic discussion, right? Not so much about agreeing with a classmate, colleague, or simply liking what they have to say, but engaging with their ideas, extending the thinking, discussing why you found their ideas meaningful. And make sure you read those requirements on the discussion board rubric if you haven't already. Now, we do enter the discussion scores manually into the participation peer response category. So you're not necessarily going to see a score appear for that one as immediately as your reading response do on Thursday nights typically. I'm going to try to make it through some key talking points a bit faster because we've got 5 chapters of Lancashire Nobel to cover, plus the article, but I'm really geeking out over this content. And by the way, in hindsight, I think I kind of restrained myself last week with G, so I'm a little bit worried that maybe I'm going to get a little crazy about G next week. We'll see how it goes, though. Okay, so with Chapter 4 of Thanks to Your Nobel, we jump right into Remix, which is on page 95, which they call a concept associated with cultural practices. Remix involves taking cultural artifacts and combining and manipulating them into new kinds of creative blends and products. Look at 2019. Remix is everywhere. It's in all we do presently. Each of you could pause this video, pull up your social media right now, and find an example of Remix, probably somewhere in your Facebook or something like that. I would be willing to bet. Feel free to pause right now and do that, and see. That in itself would be an interesting experiment, right? So essentially, it was born of music. It has obviously greatly expanded in the digital age, but the 2 purposes by which they feel it is relevant and subsequently will unpack in the chapter. 1, the general principle of remix as a necessary condition for a robust and democratic culture. That's an intriguing notion, right? And 2, the status of digital remixing as a new norm for writing. That's off page 97. They call remix necessary for a robust democratic culture and the status of it as a new norm for writing. And of course, we're not talking about writing as in pen and paper, right, but writing as a knowledge constructing process. So some typical examples, or the section, some typical examples of remix practices is a great section. And don't forget the appendix table on page 127 through 140. On the one hand, I'll say this list of possible practices, yeah, it makes me geek out and get giddy about some of these ideas. But on the other hand, it's fascinating to calm down and pause and ponder and each of them and think about the multimodal forms. The forms of communication, the social roles of the sender and the receiver in the communication, and how some of these practices quite simply build and shape our cultural identity right now before our very eyes, and that certainly ties into that first purpose of a robust democratic culture, right? That these remix practices are happening right before our very eyes right now in the digital media. They also note their logic and how they structure this, which is important to consider. And remember to note that influence of Jim G when you see references to discourse and when the word situated pops up somewhere, right? Page 1 and 2, they say, to understand these practices in terms of new literacies, we have used 4 organizing concepts in the appendix. Kinds of remixes, kinds of involvement, some literacy dimensions, and some online spaces, sites, and examples. This is intended to help explicate the complex relationships among social practices, participation in practices, discourse, capital D, affiliations, situated literacy performances, word situated, and sites and contexts of activity, roles, and relationships within interest communities, and so on. Whew. Okay. That's heavy. But as heavy a statement as all that is the stuff that they will be organizing and unpacking in that appendix table. And this is one of the reasons why you know that not only is it really good stuff, but it's also a little bit complicated because they are taking time to unpack it visually and organize it better in that table than in the narrative paragraph structure of the chapter, right? They further say on page 103, people engage in digital image remixing for a range of purposes and in the context of various kinds of practices and memberships in different kinds of communities and affinities. Makes sense. Different kinds of things people could be fans of different kinds of things people could identify with, right? They're fairly clear as we advance through this discussion, further underscoring that new literacies is not just about technology. We must look at all dimensions of literacy in the social world because, on page 104, if we just focus on what is involved in producing image remix artifacts, we will capture only a fraction of the literacy's dimension. So in other words, remix is not just about the product. Remix is not just about the thing you see on Facebook that pops up. It's about the process, right? It's about the individuals associated with it as well. I think their discussion on music remix, page 104 to 107, pardon the pun, should strike a very familiar chord with all of us. Thank you. At any age, because this may be one very familiar and very common thread for everyone potentially that can draw multiple groups and identities more into the remix practice from far and wide and more into a more focused new literacies direction with it. On the surface, you might not feel that the fan fiction and fan anime manga practice sections, page 110 to 126, are everyone's cup of tea. But imagine some of the possibilities in getting students to write fan fiction, to tap that energy for what they truly identify with, what they consider themselves a fan of. On the one hand, it may significantly depart from the content requirements that they need to be writing about. But imagine the passion, imagine the outpouring of effort and creativity, right? The majority of the mass of this chapter will feel like it's examples of fan fiction and such, and they have a great breakdown of types of fan fiction writing that can help calm the waters for you a little bit and separate fan fiction some more meaningful chunks. Possibly inspire some further thinking. Those are the 5 bulleted categories on page 111 to 112. I hope that as you look at that list of those 5 bulleted categories, or maybe elsewhere in this section, I hope you pause and have at least one, wow, that would be cool moment when you look at that relative to the classroom. Okay, chapter 5. Now we're moving in the territory of blogs and wikis. Blogs and wikis have taken on somewhat of a different role now than 10 years ago. Initially, they seemed to be everywhere. They were explosive. Now it seems like we only think about Wikipedia when we think about wikis. But there are indeed active blogs and active wikis right now with purpose and participation, right? This phenomenon is as active as ever, but it's a great deal more specialized right now. These authors are especially interested in some of the different forms participation takes within these contexts and what it means to think of contributors collaborating, page 141. All thanks to the quantum simplification of web publishing on page 142. And you have to admit, right now, compared to the inception of the internet, super easy, right? The key is that they've moved in a direction, blogs and wikis have moved in that direction of focus and specialization, right? And I will say I have the Star Trek, the Star Wars, and the Transformers fan wikis bookmarked on my computer. Because, I mean, why not, right? Regarding regular following versus browsing, Facebook and Facebook followings have clearly impacted some of the thunder of blogging, I think, in many ways. blogging Project Runway, page 147 to 157. It's a very interesting section. And the blog Project Runway was a blog that my wife actively followed as an ongoing fan of that show, still does. And what's amazing about this section is notice how this section spans so much more than just the show and blogging. It's a slice of our social and cultural world, all of it intersecting, right? Regarding wikis, it's interesting to consider outside of locating entries on Wikipedia for rapid information purposes, wikis remain less commonly subscribed to and are less familiar to readers at large than our blogs, and are more complex, partly on account of their intensely collaborative purpose. It's page 149. Makes sense, right? Additionally, an interesting list they share on page 160 of typical wiki procedures. Now, I call that to your attention because that list of typical wiki procedures on page 160 could make a nice set of classroom rules for a classroom wiki. And they say, relative to our focus here, 2 points stand out from a survey of this burgeoning literature. First, across the variety of topics and themes in the overall academic literature on wikis, the association between the use of wikis as a tool or medium and the idea of users involved in collaboration of one kind or another, or participation in collaborative endeavors, is almost universal. In other words, no matter what literature you look at about blogs and wikis, according to our authors, collaboration is the common theme. Blogs are, even if one person is publishing that blog, it is still collaborative because the person publishing that blog is responding to and indirectly engaging with the followers and the commentors on the blog, right? Also, on page 163, they say the second point of interest here to emerge from a survey of the literature on wikis builds on the first and runs parallel to the case of blogs. It is that many studies privilege content and structural aspects of wikis, and relatively few focus in any depth and intricacy on the cultural richness and diversity of wiki-mediated social practices and on the respective orientations of readers, writers, and reader-writers. Again, that's page 163. So most of the research focuses on the structural considerations and not as much on the cultural importance. I find that fascinating. Jumping back just a bit, I wanted to keep those 2 points in parallel, but jumping back again to page 161, they say, yet, if we are wanting to understand wikis in terms of new literacies, it is crucial that we get a good sense of how roles and relationships and intersecting knowledges and understandings and discourse, capital D, affiliations and skills, etc., come together to carry a practice, a kind of system of activity that can, in a reasonably clear sense, be understood as shared, as constituting a moment of culture in which people are indeed bound together as collective cultural producers and members. So once again, they're emphasizing that thread that blogs and wikis fundamentally are a collaborative endeavor. According to their interpretation of the literature and their discussion, you will not find blogs and wikis existing in a vacuum, for example. Great list of 3 dimensions of wikis, page 163, 164, as a medium for knowledge building. So page 165. They are insistent that wikis are not the most important or the be-all. They are clear that they think this is a great way to examine the role of collaboration in the sense of new literacies. This is a very important distinction. They are not saying you must do blogs and wikis. What they are saying is if you are interested in collaboration, you must consider blogs and wikis. Thus, if you want students to develop collaborative skills in a new literacy sense, this would seem to be a very viable option, if not your best, but not necessarily the best. In other words, our authors are kind of pragmatic, and they conclude the chapter with further examples that fit their discussion. So if you value collaborative interaction in your classroom, and you want to move things in a more staunch new literacies direction, Chapter 5 should be a goldmine for you. That's, I think, the take-home point. For Chapter 6, They have great questions to kick off this chapter. The three main background issues that they put forward are indeed relevant. First, how we operate separate online social networking practices from various online interactions that may or may not network in the same sense. Second, to what extent should we understand online social networking in the context of established social theory? And that's a big one. That's a big one. And third, how do we distinguish between strategic and organic social networking interaction? That's page 175. I find the third very fascinating as well. I think all of this is best captured with a somewhat lengthier passage here on page 177. But they say, with respect to drawing on formal theory, we believe that some elements of theory and research about social networks are essential for understanding social networking practices of a more strategic nature, ergo networking as leverage, and indeed for understanding the evolving design and architecture of social networking platforms. In addition, elements of formal theory and research speak directly to the contingent link between the flowering of online social media and communication platforms and services and the current buzz, which is near deafening around social networking practices. Furthermore, social network theory affirms the role and place of the individual at the center of his or her networks and identifies theoretical advantages for understanding important aspects of social structure and social order that can be derived from focusing on social networks rather than social groups or a community. Again, page 177. Okay, so don't worry. They unpack a lot of this further as we advance through the discussion. From 179, social network theorists see networks as composed of individuals, or another word for that would be nodes, who are tied to one another in various types of relationships, ties, of varying degrees and types of interdependence. And the concept of networked individualism portends a significant shift from societies organized around groups, kinship, workplace, local groups, etc., to societies organized around the individual as the primary unit of connectivity. That's page 181. Imagine the implications of our students in our classrooms suddenly becoming the primary unit of connectivity as opposed to larger social structures, larger social arenas. Suddenly our students have the power through social networking to be the primary unit of connectivity in the cultural and the social world. That is powerful. It's staggering because there are implications of the types of responsibilities that we may now have as educators, but also the power and the ability of our students under proper guidance to affect positive social change. Clearly, they raise some concerns about social networking and its reach and the reach of platforms, and I think their examples do a very solid job of capturing the perspective of the user. Their case study examples, Tanya, Corey, Chris, for example, in the chapter. And I think their discussions in this chapter on targeted social networking has suddenly become even more relevant, if not shocking, to some of us within the past 2 years or more. It's certainly now on our radar more than ever. So how does this truly pertain to literate behaviors? Think along the lines of strategic decisions that readers make when accessing a text, and think about how we have hopefully redefined our view of what a text is at this point, right? The authors state on page 204 that within an increasingly networked world, network awareness operates on two key axes: understanding network architecture and control, and understanding the social uses of networks. These two understandings may very well capture the nature of this literate behavior inherent in social network usage and participation, right? You have to understand the architecture and the literal structure of it, and you have to understand the social use of the network. You have to understand background knowledge, the social role that a text may play, and you have to have the decoding skills and the fluency to navigate the code of language in the text, right? It's almost a one-to-one. They note in transition to the next chapter, and I think that they are sounding a call for further new literacy research here on page 206. Interestingly, as the practices and potential of online social networking services and practices are becoming more widely researched and understood, their significance for learning, formal, non-formal, and informal learning alike, is being recognized and advocated by influential advocates of social learning for educational reform. Social networking is on the radar of the field of education, and a lot of experts are devoting time and energy to understanding it better. Chapter 7, 3 main ideas on how the present structure of the internet supports collaborative participation in both formal and informal settings. Page 209. These are the concepts of social learning as developed by John Seeley Brown and Richard Adler that distinguished in between push and pull paradigms for mobilizing resources in pursuit of human purposes, and the idea of building collaborative platforms for social learning. And why do they matter? On page 209. To a large extent, they are acquired via processes of social learning within participatory cultures. At the same time, however, these new literacies are integral to forms of ongoing social learning that will become increasingly important for living in the foreseeable future. So in other words, by participating in our cultural world, you will, to a large extent, acquire these social networking practices. And at the same time, these practices are going to be integral for living well. And you could maybe interpret that as for living actively literate for the foreseeable future. Interesting implications there. Social learning, of course, is not new. We've been thinking about social learning for a long time. Of course, Vygotsky made it big in education for us, right? They note on page 210 that social learning is concerned with understanding modes of learning that build on observation of situated human behavior rather than on direct involvement, and in some versions is referred to as observational learning, and in others as imitation, vicarious learning, and modeling. Social learning has a lot of different terms, a lot of different forms, depending on which direction you come at the field of education. Although keep in mind there is a very general pedagogical definition in what they explore here that may share features but may also differ a little bit here and there. Ultimately, though, it points back to the view that on page 211 that knowledge is always an outcome of sociocultural practices in which people use mental and material tools, acquire and employ skills, draw on forms of existing understanding and knowledge and belief in order to achieve goals and completed tasks. Further, on page 212, they say if we want to learn deeply, we need to access these means, contexts, and tasks that are integral to generating knowledge, not simply to content transmission and abstracted activities of application. So this is a key part of the chapter, because here they're digging deep into that fundamental bedrock foundation of where knowledge comes from, and they are saying knowledge comes from interacting socially. We've known that in education for a very long time, but now here we have social networking and the internet, the digital age, new literacies practices, where we are interacting socially in new ways. So therefore, are we constructing knowledge in new ways, right? In the social learning, multiple learning modes, and access to people section, things get heavy. Page 215, to date, societies have depended on formal higher education systems to support such learning, but this option seems to be running out of time. That is a staggering notion, right? Why do they think these changes matter now? Pedagogically, perhaps? Future living requires a much wider diffusion at many more diverse levels, since the innovation required for living well are often everyday and simple. What is important is nurturing the innovator and creative producer in every person. That's interesting. So on page 216, they're saying that indeed every human being has the potential to be an innovator and a creative producer and an influencer of the social world. And I think that is absolutely true, right? Since our current media is collaborative multimedia, it can support multiple modes of learning, which is great for differentiation of education, right? Multiple learning styles. I also like their thinking that in the present age it's more about page 216, offering access to other people than simply in terms of providing access to information. Offering access to others. Opening the knowledge base opening collaboration to others. Interesting. By the way, I hope you've been noticing the reflection discussion in this and the previous chapter. Very solid questions and topics to pause and kind of put your brain through a few cycles as you go by those. They kick off the social learning, participation, and learning to be section. That kickoff to that is fascinating, and note how they inject Jim G into that citation on page 218 with that word situated. By social learning, Brown and Adler mean in the first place learning based on the assumption that our understanding of concepts and processes is constructed socially in conversations about the matters in question, and through grounded and situated, and they have their "and situated" in brackets there, right? Which means they are injecting a little bit of flavor of Jim G into someone else's citation that they're citing. That's fascinating. That means that they believe so much in Jim G's work that they will infuse it into someone else that they are citing in their text to make sure that it comes together, right? So it sounds like a kind of an academic remix, right? I'll back that up again. By social learning, Brown and Adler mean in the first place learning based on the assumption that our understanding of concepts and processes is constructed socially in conversation about the matters in question, and through grounded and situated interactions, especially with others, around problems or actions. Again, page 218. To put it in an even more pedagogical perspective, what we learn is a consequence of how we learn, and social learning has a very different take from the traditional formal learning on the how. Furthermore, on page 218, social learning also puts the emphasis squarely on the learning to be. Social learning is all about learning to be a thinker, learning to be a knowledge constructor, right? That's powerful. And how can you not appreciate this? Not just for what it is, but also the context of the course on page 219. By deep learning, as against the kind of surface learning reflected in the myriad examples of the kind that Gardner refers to, G means that learning can generate real understanding, the ability to apply one's knowledge, and to even transform that knowledge for innovation. Wow. I think some of you might find some familiar tones in the section, some more everyday examples of social learning, and I like the reminder that internet-free interactions are still important. Very interesting to note that blog and wiki work often begin, page 223, with the efforts of passionate amateurs. And what a great example that they have to follow from The Sims. And regarding push versus pull, this big shift entails a move from the familiar push paradigm toward an emergent pull paradigm as the condition for being successful change. That's page 227. Push equals intensive and often large-scale planning and program development. Page 227, 228. Pull equals serendipity through access, attract, and achieve. That's page 228. So in this context, clearly pull is supporting modern social networking and collaboration. Let me back that up and let me go through that one once again. The big shift that we're experiencing culturally through these things that they're talking about here entails a move from a familiar push paradigm toward an emergent pull paradigm as the conditions for being successful change in the social world, right? So push was intensive and large-scale planning and programming development, right? Pushing large formal curriculum on you. Pull involves serendipity through access, attract, and achieve. You pull knowledge towards yourself and work with it, right? Pull is clearly supporting modern social networking right now. Wow, I know this is getting tough. We got one chapter left. It's chapter 8. It's all right. This is much quicker one to discuss because this chapter really consists of two rich case study examples of social learning in the context of new literacies. In other words, they feel so passionate about these concepts that they're talking about in chapter 7 that they want to make sure we have two very solid, lengthy examples that we can examine and see lots of the things that they're talking about. So the aim of their first one, to immerse practicing teachers in ways of pulling learning so that if they wish to ponder them further and explore ways of extending them to their own work in schools, as well as in their own ongoing learning as professional people within a domain of activity, they are better placed to do so than they might otherwise have been. It's page 223. And the second example, the quest to learn Q2L school was envisioned partly in response to the possibility of school becoming a catalyst for activating a network of mentors, partners, peers, and leaders focused on helping kids figure out how to be inventors, designers, and problem solvers. And that's page 246 to 247. Both of these case studies not only offer rich case study methodology examples, but multiple opportunities for you to consider what you see happening in this case study example in the context of the new literacies theory that they have been discussing and laying out in previous chapters. So in other words, as you read these case studies, you should see stuff going on and you should say, I get that. I see why that's meaningful. I see why that matters. So how do you feel about reaching a section called the end? I find it invigorating and empowering because there's so much of their thinking that I think we have in hand. But also because they say, page 253, the current round of new literacy simultaneously ups the ante and enriches and enlarges the possibilities for social learning. Why else would we want to examine promising pedagogical options if not to enrich our classrooms and up the ante on learning, right? Do you consider the following statement optimistic or a cautionary statement? Personally, I think it simply means that we need to keep our heads in the game. When they say on page 254. At the same time, however, it is clear that right now a complex set of social, technological, economic, and cultural conditions are converging in ways that present interesting and expansive possibilities for extending a social learning approach into formal education in ways that can resist counterproductive forms and efforts of compartmentalized curricular learning, and to help that portion of learning that occurs outside the school optimally connected to life trajectories beyond the classrooms. Wow. We should keep our heads in the game because, as they state in conclusion, page 254, it is a worthy challenge since the prospects of present and future generations for learning and living as well as they can call for nothing less. So in other words, if all this stuff that they've been unpacking in these chapters can affect positive change in the social world because of the ways people are communicating and building knowledge and collaborating and create a better world, and that's what our students deserve to have the power to do, right? Okay. So, the art and craft of endless hybridization, remix. This article, it's great to examine more closely if you enjoyed Chapter 4 of their text. It's a solid example of drawing out new literacy for a close look. They remind us that remix means to take cultural artifacts and combine and manipulate them to make new kinds of creative blends, and they even suggest culture as a whole could be considered remix, and it has not simply emerged with digitization. Remix is not new. Page 22. Since young people are jumping into remix en masse, they note that their concern here, however, is with more specific sense of remix, one associated particularly with fan practices and are undertaken using the capacities of computers to remix music, digital images, text, sounds, and animation. Page 23. The examples they share in successive pages of this article should call to mind examples and discussions from the previous chapters of the book we've been looking at, but I do think they unpack them in a somewhat more practice-friendly manner in this article. Browse the headings, search for some of your favorite things, right? Definitely note the two types of hybridization they offer from biology on page 25. It's an interesting way to consider this because on page 25, the word hybridization captures important dimensions of the relationship between cultural development and remix practices. But where does art come into play, right? The endless art that's in the title. By the art of remix, we mean the aesthetics, appreciation, form, and composition dimensions of remix practices. That's what I love. I love that there's an artistic quality to this. Note their definition of literacy in G's discourses with that capital D when they say, page 28, we define literacies as socially recognized ways of generating, communicating, and negotiating meaningful content through the medium of encoded text within the context of participation in discourses or as members of discourses. And they subsequently cite G as well, there on page 28. Indeed, they remind us of the multimodal nature of remix, stating on page 29, advocates of social practice approach to literacy and literacy education emphasize the multidimensional nature of literacy. Both the powerful tools, manipulation and distribution, and the remix and classroom teaching and learning sections feature a lot of familiar G from week and module 2. And these two sections hopefully feel very comfortable to you after that first portion of G last week. And what a great concluding point, possibly a pedagogical pep talk, page 32. While educationally satisfying and productive integration of remix theory and practices into classroom learning is no simple matter, we would argue that time and effort expended in pursuing principled appropriations and leverage of the qualities that they have that incline young people to invest so much of themselves in creative remix will prove educationally beneficial for learners and teachers alike. It's page 32. Whew, wow, we did it. Okay, so again, I'll have an additional video this week with tips and suggestions for the theoretical exploration short paper, and please continue to be reaching out through your A-State email with those questions about your new literacies topic for your theoretical exploration paper as your thoughts, as you grow it further and as you geek out over that topic. That would be great. Wolves up. We'll see you in the next module.